Welcome everybody. So when we were putting together this program, I immediately thought of Mamoun and Aida because they often come to visit me and my colleagues at Microsoft with laundry lists of, I'm not going to say complaints, but ideas that are very helpful and very useful. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for them to present the kind of issues that they are seeing with OpenType and apps and products out there today. And as this is being recorded, it'll be a YouTube video, which I can hopefully be able to take to all the bosses and share with people at work and elsewhere and help put pressure on people to improve OpenType support for Arabic, but particularly our products. So yeah, we're going to have a video and then the Q&A. So put the questions in the chat under the question mark if you can, but in the chat's fine. And then we will do Q&A after the video. So if you're ready, you can roll it.
Welcome and thank you, everyone. My name is Mamoun Sakkal.
And I'm Aida Sakkal. We'll be talking about deficiencies in handling justification for the Arabic script with a focus on the major shaping engines.
Almost 20 years ago now, in 2003, I gave my first presentation at ATypI conference in Vancouver, BC, in which I endorsed OpenType benefits and showed many features to enable designers to produce fine Arabic typography. These include the ability to provide contextual alternates, especially useful for cursive styles of Arabic text, as well as cursive positioning that allows us to vary the entry and exit heights as glyphs are connected one to another. The ability to have multiple kashida or tatweel was especially exciting, as well as fine control over the position of vowel marks. And these benefits extended to all types of Arabic fonts. These features are still extremely useful today, although many have already become quite expected and normal. There are still deficiencies in handling the Arabic script, including the following issues: spacing between glyphs and scripts, kerning of text in cascading styles, the dots collision avoidance problem, and dots anchors differentiation, as well as justification and tatweel/kashida. We will briefly present these and focus on the last issues of justification and kashida treatment, and then we'll propose a new no kashida OpenType table.
Let's start with spacing between glyphs and scripts. Spacing between glyphs, as long as they're part of the same script, is generally okay. We can define kerning pairs or even simple single adjustments, things like moving letters closer to other letters, although longer runs of letters gets iffy again. The key here is as long as they're part of the same script. Spacing between scripts is a much trickier issue. The major shaping engines are looking at scripts as defined by Unicode characters, and there are run processes that end at script boundaries. This prevents things like kerning Latin numbers or punctuation with Arabic letters and symbols, which is necessary. Unfortunately, this is likely very complex to universally solve, as it requires some redefinition at the script and language system level in the OpenType standard itself, and major changes to each of the various shaping engines. Here's an example using the end of Aida, where the digits display to the right, even though I've started by clicking on the left side and typing. and should actually be positioned inside the circle. And when I click back to the left side, they all switch to the Arabic characters, and some do in fact pop into the circle. And another example showing how simply deleting one number switches the number systems back and forth. There are some specific solutions to some of these between script spacing issues in place, but having a more standard definition would be helpful not just in Arabic, but with many other scripts as well. A somewhat simpler option, or an interim solution to a complete overhaul, could be to add an intermediate feature that are called between script boundaries designed to handle the various boundary issues. These would be more specific solutions and likely different for each shaping engine. Maybe not ideal since they wouldn't be absolutely consistent, but probably better than nothing since much of the desired behavior is fairly consistent. Kerning of text in cascading styles is a massively difficult issue to solve with the major shaping engines as they currently exist, excluding some specialized options such as using ATypI's Arabic platform. There are several factors which contribute to the complexity in solving cascading kerning separate from the actual kerning itself. In particular, hit testing and selection, that is what to do with the cursor, especially when text runs overlap each other, and the display, where some of the text runs will start getting stacked really, really high. The actual kerning itself presents its own set of issues, for example, derived from the fact that these text runs have overlaps of non-rectangular shapes. There is some interesting work being done for contextual and cascading kerning as designers increase the complexity of their fonts and are finding that they need this kind of kerning to achieve the results they're after. Hopefully this means there will be more designers asking for better ways of handling complex contextual kerning. For now, partial solutions seem to be the best case, and as a designer you're likely going to have to pick your priorities. It is possible to use programming scripts to kind of brute force generate the many massive kerning tables needed to handle complex contextual kerning, but without personal experience, I'm not sure how practical they end up in terms of size or processing. Dots and mark collision avoidance is something that's necessary across various aspects of Arabic shaping in general, but this is a particularly complex issue when it comes to the letter Yeh Barri. This unique letter extends back underneath the preceding letters, causing all kinds of potential collision scenarios with dots, marks, and the preceding letters themselves. The longer the tail, the more conditions need to be accounted for, which involves two key steps: finding cases for potential crashes and putting in the OpenType necessary to avoid them, as well as developing tests to make sure that everything is working correctly. The methods available to do this are actually quite diverse. We can have glyph alternates with pre-position shifts, use kerning either in pairs or single adjustments, and even build and shift letters, dots, and marks dynamically through parts. There's also the option of designing the tail shorter, though this isn't aesthetically preferred. In practice, we use several methods together and get the best results by designing in all the solutions at the start of a font. However, it is important to note that as a font increases in language coverage and complexity, for example, adding alternates, ligatures, stylistic sets, the OpenType and testing necessary to avoid dot mark letter collisions increases drastically. So for an example, here are a few pages of one Urdu test document I made while we were developing Calibri Arabic. Not sure if you can see it, but note the crazy page number. I think this document was around 235 pages, and we had several of these. One other issue tailing into the collision avoidance is the fact that at the moment, anchors which are attached to ligature components are non-differentiable when using the same anchor. That is, there is no way of tracing back through OpenType programming to which of the original glyphs an anchor belongs once a ligature is formed. The shaping engines themselves do keep track of the input strings, which is why backspacing in the middle of a ligature functions exactly the way you would expect it to. Since gsub is processed before gpos, once the ligature has been substituted, any gpos lookups will then only see a trailing list of marks without a way of knowing which ligature component a given mark is attached to. So in my example here, you can see we have a lam elif with the marks below, and what we would like is to have the mark on the lam lowered when re is in front of it. Gpos in the context will only see the string of lam elif below mark, which is fine when they both have marks or when only the lam has mark. However, the last two examples, the string looks exactly the same. It will see re, lam elif, below mark, and now you don't know if that's below mark 1 or below mark 2. So you end up with both cases of a single mark getting lowered the same distance, regardless of which letter it actually belongs to. So one workaround for this is to have multiple sets of all mark type glyphs to be used with specific ligature components. This does work, but as a font scales up in complexity, this too can become quite complicated to manage. As far as I know, this is an actual bug within OpenType.
I realize that text justification is handled by line layout mechanisms, but I still believe it is useful to discuss it here due to its importance to our subject. The JALT table is the only table in OpenType that interacts with line layout functionality, and I wish more applications would take advantage of it. A couple of terms used in this presentation are tatweel, in English elongation, is the extension of the connection between two letters, also called kashida from Persian. In calligraphy, the term used is wasl, or connection. The term swash here is a wider version of a glyph. Justification in Arabic text is best achieved by first adjusting tatweel. This is because the designer has already provided the tools or the right arrangement for extending text. Then, by adding swashes, these are usually more pronounced glyphs, and depending on the design, they could be quite effective and non-obtrusive. 3, using alternate letters. These are different forms of letters that could occupy less or more space and thus can help us elongate or condense the line. 4, adjusting the spaces between the words. I leave this to the last resort, again, because I believe that achieving a balanced gray color in the text is best achieved by following what is specifically designed by the font creator. These factors are also affected by the design of each font, depending on what is the goal of the designer of these fonts. We have uploaded some reports that deal with justification to www.sakkal.com/type/. You can review these for more detailed information. Here is an example of a metal typeset book from the 19th century. In this example, we can see that the typesetter has used different spacers between the words in order to adjust the line width. Some lines, like line 4, 1, 4, and the last from the bottom, include wider spaces, while the others include narrower spaces. In addition, there are a couple swashes where the extension is provided by a special form of the final alif shape. Notice that these are actually in the lines where we already have white spaces, so there was a real need to include these here. And then, in addition to those, we have a number of kashidas or tatweel glyphs, in this case sorts, and these are of a uniform width except for two narrow ones used before and after the letter kaf. Finally, this page doesn't include any alternate letters to handle justification or line width, but it includes a few special sorts where the typesetter either broke the end of the sort or of two sorts in order to overlap the upper stroke of the kaf. This is always a tricky letter in Arabic calligraphy and typography because it extends substantially to the right usually. These are marked in red circles here, and they fit into the text pretty well. Unlike the previous book, in this page, the typesetter relied mainly on swash variants to adjust justification and used white spaces for the rest of the lines. Ironically, he used the kashidas only in the thuluth style title on the top in order to break or to add more space between the kaf and the following lam, although in this case he broke a proper form because usually kaf should be closer to lam. Today, Arabic fonts are designed in the following broad categories: hybrid Kufi cursive, Kufi based, and cursive or naskhi based. Of course, cursive includes many styles, but naskh is the most common used. Kufi includes various styles, and in each of these categories, we usually see flat tatweel or kashidas incorporated as part of the design. The unique Kufi-based fonts actually have a double kashida that is used for a number of letters, and we did develop in some of our fonts a double kashida that allows the user to extend a double line as if it was a single kashida. In cursive calligraphy, a curved tatweel is desirable. This is the most challenging to properly design in a font, but it's the most favored style for long texts by users. We conducted a survey a couple months ago, and we found a clear preference for naskh in Arab countries. Some other regions have different preferences, but in our case, we know that curved kashida or curved tatweel is a challenge that requires quite a bit of work. Tatweel or kashida is now an integral part of Arabic typography. Although it started as a solution to handle justification, it became a visual feature that is favored sometimes by designers, by calligraphers, and by typographers. This is clear when we see that handwritten calligraphy is now imitating flat kashidas that came from typography, and this is something that has been occurring for the last 40 or 50 years. In these examples from Syria and Egypt, you can see how the flat tatweel is written by hand, sometimes with a slight curvature, but in other cases completely flat, as if drawn by a ruler. So flat tatweel is no longer just a method for justification. It is becoming a graphic feature that is used by some typographers in various media. I can recall here the extremely wide kashidas used by Wa'el Murqus on the exterior of a building in New York. And while I was preparing this presentation, I ran across this ad where a font is used to give a similar impact, a similar effect to the handwritten titles which we've seen in the previous slide. This is a font by Sultan Makhtari, an excellent type designer, where he provided a number of letter forms that are in the style of handwritten flat kashidas. Now, it happened that this ad was made by a designer who is also a restaurant owner, and I was quite amused to see his note on Twitter: I make design in the morning and shawarma in the evening. Tatweel typographic rules are based on calligraphic traditions, and these change according to style. However, typographic tatweel rules cannot be a complete emulation due to the divergent purposes of typography and calligraphy. In calligraphy, tatweel is an important aspect of line composition. The composition of the line is determined by the mass or the black clusters of letters, by the vowel marks, 3, the alternate sizes that are required to expand or contract the writing, and finally by the forced alternates. These are alternates that may be required to adjust the position of the line or the height of the line, depending on what letters are already written and what may come following. So if we take a calligraphic line by Master Zaki al-Hashimi, you can see that there are many adjustments, many minute small adjustments that are made to several of these letters. For example, the Yeh is smaller to relate to the following letter. The tails of the Waw, and Ra are raised. These little adjustments are usually absent in typographic compositions. So superimposing a line of our font Kitab shows a similarity in the general form, but less variation, and here we can also see the absence of the central ligature due to the decision that we have made to keep the height of the typographic line as small as possible. We do have this ligature in the initial position, but if a long letter comes before it, it drops down to the baseline. Now, when the vowel marks are added, the line becomes complete, and this here is the intended full composition as a calligraphic line. Another composition here incorporates swash and tatweel, and for this master calligrapher, an important criteria for where to add tatweel in the text is to look for whether a vowel mark fatha can be written on top, because that will allow the calligrapher to fill in the space. If the letter doesn't have a fatha, if it has a dhamma or a kasra, then no tatweel is recommended for that position. Now, this reason is rarely used when we think about tatweel in typography, because vowel marks are rarely used in everyday documents. So instead of emulating tatweel rules in artistic calligraphy, we need to continue refining the justification priority rules. Inserting tatweel should be based on handwritten long texts, not on artistic calligraphic pieces. Good progress has been achieved on this front in the past, but not always in an organized direction. For example, the kashida expansion priority system in Office seems to be overridden rather than refined over the years. On the left, you can see the priority that's given to locations where kashida would be added in this system, after sin and sad, before dal and he, before kaf, lam alif and alif, especially before the letter connecting to a final rising ligature. This is a good system, but it could be refined further in order to have wider acceptance and more uniformity in application. The same is also true with Adobe Justification system in its Creative Cloud applications. Decotype developed the most powerful solution for typesetting Arabic with a comprehensive set of controls over all aspects of composition, including tatweel. However, applying auto-justification often produces unpleasant layouts. As you can see here, for example, on line 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tatweels are stacked next to each other, creating an open line within the page of text. And this is true in almost every page of this otherwise excellent Quran. In our own fonts, rather than providing tatweel throughout, as we did in Arabic typesetting, the new Sakkal Kitab restricts tatweel to locations that produce pleasing text composition only, as you can see in the lower example. So in here, we don't give the user the ability to add tatweel wherever they please, and as a consequence, adding automatic tatweel will also produce a better line because it is not randomly applied. And here is a full page layout of Sakkal Kitab, where justification is achieved by a balanced combination of tatweel or kashidas, swashes, and white spaces.
The last issue we're going to talk about involves the insertion of kashidas specifically with automatic justification and my proposed solution. Many modern fonts use some kind of parts ligature system where partial ligature alternates are contextually substituted to produce a visually ligated combination instead of using an actual ligature glyph. Here you can see an example of a precomposed ligature on the left, 2 letters, Yeh, Yeh, and on the right, a contextual alternate, which are effectively ligature parts, where we have Yeh, Yeh, and then the first half of the Yeh ligature, second half of the Yeh ligature, combined, 2 glyphs, looks like a ligature. In Arabic, this is particularly useful because you can provide huge numbers of ligature combinations with significantly fewer glyphs. This also makes fonts that cover many languages much smaller and easier to manage. An example with a typical ligature, final be, or tooth, with re. In a full Unicode coverage font, there are 54 shapes in the be tooth group and 19 in the re group. With precomposed ligatures, we would need 1,026 ligatures, 54 teeth times 19 re. Using a partial ligature alternate, we would only need 73 glyphs, 54 teeth plus 19 re. One of the other reasons this is particularly efficient for Arabic is because you can often use a letter part in multiple ligature combinations. For example, each of the colors in this graphic here represents the same part, and you can see how they are used in multiple ligatures. One of the major problems with auto-justification for Arabic is that all of the OpenType layout processing is done before any of the line break treatments, so the OpenType is not reconsidered when additional spaces or kashidas are inserted. This isn't as big of an issue if only spaces are used, but becomes a big problem once kashidas are inserted, particularly with parts ligature style fonts such as Sakkal Majella, Office's Al-Dabi, which is seen in the example here, and Urdu typesetting, Aisha Naskh Dubai font, and many others. I would like to point out that typing a kashida manually in the same place where the auto justification inserted it does not have the same effect because, since the OpenType is reprocessed, the alternates simply aren't substituted. So here we have center column. This is the way that they should look in their ligated form. To the right, you can see that the auto justification has inserted a kashida in between the 2 components of the ligature. And on the left, you can see if I just typed the kashida in that place myself, you simply get an extension. As font designers, we have limited control on OpenType processing and line layout mechanisms. Even if the JSTF justification table is implemented, it doesn't really seem to be anywhere at the moment, there still wouldn't be a way to prevent these auto-justified kashida breaks. So back in 2013, I proposed that a new table be added to OpenType, which would allow a designer to designate glyphs which aren't allowed to have kashidas inserted after. In parts ligature style fonts, the exclusion list would just be all of the front end connecting ligature components. The auto-justification algorithms would then check that a glyph isn't included in the no kashida table before inserting a kashida. This is a simple technical solution to fix one of the most obvious failures in Arabic text composition. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to make much progress towards getting it implemented, though I have presented the idea several times. So some current workarounds that are actually in use right now. Make your kashidas zero width so you only get spaces inserted during auto justification. This is limiting, and people often want kashidas in their justified text, but this is current common practice for fonts with curved baseline connections especially. Another option is to just use precomposed ligatures instead of parts. This becomes inefficient for large fonts, as we briefly demonstrated. The number of glyphs increases very, very quickly, especially for full language coverage fonts. An alternative to fully precomposed ligatures is to have a skeleton ligature and have all the dots placed dynamically through OpenType, which is much more efficient for large fonts, but can be difficult for the designer to manage and test all cases. And lastly, a combination of the above, which is probably the best option for full typographic features. But none of these completely solves the problem, and this is why we hope the big players, Microsoft, Adobe, Apple, and Google, will adapt our proposed no kashida table and bring it to life.
Shukran. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Okay. I think all three of us are now back in live.
Yeah.
So I know you're following along. Lots of great discussion in the chat. Do you want to address any of the questions that came up?
Yeah. Peter, do you need a more clear explanation of swash versus tatweel still? Yay, nay? Oh, a lot of chat time. Okay, Aida, maybe just do a quick explanation of swash versus tatweel, and I'm going to scroll back up.
It looks like an issue that has been discussed quite a bit is the difference between what we call a tatweel or kashida and swash glyphs. The purpose of the two is the same, is to provide a wider version of either an isolated or final glyph or a connection between two glyphs. The tatweel involves always two letters connecting to each other, and that's why we make some distinction from other forms where a letter tail end or part of the final swash is extended. The effect on the text is pretty much the same, but in typical metal typography, swashes were isolated or independent sorts, while kashidas were separate pieces that are inserted between two different letters. In digital typography, it depends on how the design is implemented. It can be a modification of an initial and a medial or final glyph, or it can be a separate piece as in metal typography. For example, Aida, what's the name of the Pakistani font with curves?
Or do typesetting? No.
No.
Which one?
Aisha.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yes. It is a digital font where the designer broke up the letters into components, where you have first component, last component, and a medial tatweel in order to get fine cursive kashida. So in this case, it is using a very similar concept to metal typography, but in a much updated form.
So 2 comments on the things from the chat. Reprocessing all of the OpenType during kerning could potentially just get so iterative that it ends up slowing all the way down. I don't know if that's necessarily the best idea to actually go through and reprocess all the things. Implementing the actual justification table with the priorities would probably be a better way of doing a more iterative justification. But this table would just be very simple. Don't put a kashida here because these are interesting connections that are not on the baseline, so they shouldn't be interrupted. And those would have to come from the designer because every font's parts for their ligatures are going to be different. So you can't universally say, never insert it after a tooth because that's just not right. Computer's very small. And then the other thing was what? Table that's used in the layout engine, not the shaping engine. Yeah. It would only be used by the auto justification because there's no other reason, there's no other need to process it during normal OpenType shaping. It's post shaping. Yes?
And John Hudson posted one under the question mark. Do you see that?
Okay. Oh, I see it now.
So let me just come in. Sorry, do you want to read it? Because other people can't see that.
Yeah, okay. The screen is very small. The no kashida table idea addresses the specific font implementation level, but is there perhaps room also for a mid-level standardization between generic justification algorithms and font-specific defined in the script style level? Maybe, but again, if different fonts aren't going to include different ligatures, I think you can probably define some basic kashida rules per style, but people will definitely argue about which rules are the right rules and which ones aren't. We're just trying to make the fonts not break, ideally.
I think we don't have any control over how designers are going to design their fonts. We know that someone will always find a different way to producing a certain result. So I doubt that we can have enough system level control that would take care of all these different conditions. So I think on one hand, if the generic justification algorithm can take into account the style, that would be a good improvement because there are sometimes clear differences. But I don't think that's going to prevent the problem.
Simon, you're saying the engine is taking the glyph instead of talking characters. I think one of the issues here is that the kashida is, I think it's unique to the Arabic script. So this treatment is only happening for Arabic scripts. There's no reason for the justification to have this in any other language. So it's very likely that they're just taking that. That's the whole purpose of this glyph. It's only needed in this one script. So anything we implement is going to be script specific and probably not. I don't think you can get rid of it because people still need to be able to do it. Right. No, we agree.
I have one question.
Yeah.
I'm interested in Mamoun's background. Is that a screen cap? Is that a photo from the 90s or is that a museum?
No, that's his office.
My background.
Yeah, so
that's my that's my studio. I have a poster I designed actually in the 1990s, still on the wall.
Okay. Can you use that CRT monitor?
On the floor?
No.
Okay.
I still
like
have
legacy collection.
I still have a few old computers
I think he might still have a Mac 2 stashed away up a shelf too.
I think we all do. Okay, any other real questions?
Oh, yes. Question. All right. Arabic is naturally great at justification, but maybe because of that is usually fully justified. Are there cases of the tatweel being used to make a nicer left rag?
Yes, I do use that a lot. Actually, I personally prefer this to fully justified text, mainly because that maintains the natural and more balanced spacing of white between the words, and takes care only of the worst situations where you need to make better adjustments. I'm not aware of an automatic way to do this. I do this manually because usually shorter lines immediately become obvious. So it doesn't take a lot of time to make those few adjustments. Now, in general, if one has a short text and does the justification manually, I think if the designer is good, that produces the best text layout. But in practice, it is necessary to have auto justification because, especially for Arabic, people like to have the text fully justified a lot more than English or Latin. So in my case, I use limited justification applications or tatweel or swashes only for substantially different lines, and that gives a balanced, nicer left track layout.
Thank you so much, and
Thank you, everyone.
thanks everyone. We've got 9 minutes until the next talk. You can head over to the hangout room if you like, or grab a beverage of your choice, and be back in 9 minutes.
I'll hop over to the hangout room if anyone has any more questions.
Yeah, I think we should hang out in the chat room now to continue some of these discussions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.